Hey everybody, welcome to First Congregational Church's online service. My name is Dr. Tom, pastor of said church. Good to have you all with us. Now August is in full swing and we're in our final summer series called Bad Religion. And this series from the Gospel of Luke continues with Jesus on his Passover pilgrimage to Jerusalem in preparation for the crucifixion. Now, as he gets nearer to the city and his own death, he starts to identify some bad religion on the way, hence the name. And this stuff needs correction and healing. Now, what came to be known as Christianity was a way of being in the world that ushered heaven to earth. The followers of Jesus led a counter-cultural movement against the empires, who wielded violence that gained power, both religious and political. And Jesus went head to head with these powers, both religious and governmental, in nonviolent ways that his followers just did not understand or comprehend. And then this empire crushed him, as expected, in the crucifixion event. But death could not hold Christ, and he resurrected, proving to the whole world, and especially his followers, that love overcomes evil and death. He didn't command his followers to go and build empires, not even a religious one that imposed itself upon the world, but instead showed people how to exist within the violent empires in a countercultural way that stopped using violence to fix things, instead used love, which stopped violence and evil in its tracks. So today we have some phrases from Jesus on the road as he's teaching that sound a little bit harsh, and it may even sound contradictory to some things that he's already taught about already. Now, fundamentalists and literalists who believe that God is angry with humankind will grab a passage like today and run it through their megaphone. But this passage is not meant to be a weapon against others, but a scalpel for our own soul's healing. And it's hard to hear, but not because God is ready to fly off the handle and, bring down a hammer of judgment upon our individual missteps. We need to leave this passage within its context, in which Jesus is speaking to a people, not a person. And Jesus's judgment language is for how the people collectively organize themselves tribally under banners of ideologies, weaponizing their perspectives upon the world. Because if only their tribe had the power of the world, then they could set everything right. But this way of being is violent and perpetuates injustice, and somebody's going to be left out of the system. The language Jesus uses is called apocalyptic, and it's quite common in his day. We still use it today, but we don't label it as apocalyptic. We call it metaphor, symbolic, or archetypical, if you want to get all fancy. It was very popular with the Old Testament prophets, and today Jesus quotes one of them, Micah, about how God's going to come and divide up the people for judgment. So if you have religious trauma in your past from such language, this is a trigger warning, but we do not go to the same places that they did. Which pictures God as this drunk, abusive parental figure whose anger is only held at bay by your ability to stay in line. This is nothing near what Jesus is talking about. As James Baldwin once said, God gave Noah the rainbow sign, no more water, the fire next time. Thank you, Dr. Chris Green, for that little tidbit on your podcast. It was very helpful. Now, the baptism of fire will actually come at Pentecost in Acts 2. The Holy Spirit of God descends and fills the believers, and it purifies the disciples' tribal desire for political dominance in the world. And then it instead sends them out as pilgrims in the world, showing them a different way of being, built on a unifying love around small communities of care and support. Now, God's judgment is an act of love for us, not an act of retribution against us. So be not afraid. Let's dive into this passage and see what we find.
Psalm 80, retold by Malcolm Guite. Lord, hear our sighs and bring us swift release, for we have nothing left to us but tears. No light, no joy, no strength, no health, no peace. Only the strife, the dread, the strain, the fears of these dark times. Oh, turn to us again. Show us once more the mercy of those years. when you were forming us. Remember when you called us out of exile, planted us as your own vineyard? Was it all in vain? The way you tended us and nurtured us, that we might bear good fruit in joy and peace. We have borne bitter fruit, but come to us and help us start again. Come and release with your right hand the grace we have refused, till shadows flee at last and sorrows cease.
Now, the imagery of fire is rich, and many modern religious folks have reduced its complexity to a singular notion: fire as punishment for personal wrongdoing. So when we hear Jesus say something like, "I've come to bring fire on the earth," our imagination just goes here first instinctively. Fiery damnation for evildoers who insert popular taboo subject here. And then this causes terror somewhere within our soul. And we start asking, are we good enough? Are we holy enough? Are we pure enough to flee the coming wrath of God? Now, you can do two things with this feeling of terror. You can internalize it or externalize it. Now, if you externalize it, you gain an appetite for destruction and you fantasize about God's judgment upon those people over there. But you're not hearing this passage right. Chances are that this person is weaponizing a misunderstanding of the concept of God's judgment and using their religion to justify their own hatred. And when they use their religion as an outlet for their anger upon the world around them, it just goes south. Now, this misunderstanding is hard to identify because it comes clothed in the authority of religion. And it's hard to self-identify because it feels like righteousness because you feel so strongly justified in your opinion, which is enabled by your vision of the world as you think it ought to be. And then the disconnect between your vision of how the world ought to be and the reality of what is fuels anger. Now, if you go the other route and you internalize it, then you're frightened of this passage and you would rather turn your head the other way, skip over it, not read it. And you're also not hearing this passage correctly because you have feelings of psychological inferiority, shame, guilt, insufficiency, inadequacy that may have been turned to dogma by religion and then projected upon God. And then we reinterpret this as God's feelings about us. And it's so hard to identify this one as well because we have baptized our own internal critic and called it the voice of God. Now, we should neither fear nor fantasize about God's judgment, but instead long for the judgment of God to come. What's the difference? Compassion. To long for the judgment of God is to long for things to be set right, but not according to our fantasies, where we have more power, control, or comfort and exercise those things as we will. Instead, we use our imaginations to dream of a world like Dr. King when he said, "I have a dream." And this is to long for the judgment of God to come and set the world right in a way that the most vulnerable are the major benefactors. And since God is love by nature, the judgment of God is an act of that love. So this fire that Christ comes to bring to the earth is not punishment, but judgment to refine and correct the world. Now, Christ is on the way to the cross to exercise this judgment. The crucifixion moment is the judgment of the world because we see the enslaved evil within the power of empires on display. The political powers have no choice but to execute an innocent man, almost against Pilate's will. Like he's saying, "I see no wrongdoing in this man." And the religious powers also enslave the evil of maintaining their temple system, though it demands the last 2 cents of a widow, will have to crucify the Messiah that they waited so long for. So the perfect human is put to death for treason, and God is executed for blasphemy. Christ will put this evil on full display and let our collective idolatrous worship of power crush him in death. And the judgment comes at the resurrection when Christ proves that love is more powerful and offers in grace this new human existence to us, free from the grips of power and evil. Now, I had an insect collection as a child and had this plastic case that had all these dividers in it. And then I put in the dividers all these pieces of styrofoams for backers. And then I placed a dead bug in each section with a pin that nailed it to them, and then a label telling us what it was. Now, we like to organize and divide things into categories like this because it helps our brains, right? If we collect rocks, we might take our collection and organize it according to type. If we're cleaning a closet, we might divide things into categories like save, keep, organize, trash. But we also divide ourselves up into categories like State fan or Michigan fan, pineapple goes on pizza or rational human being, cilantro lover or cilantro tastes like soap. Now these categories divide us according to personal preferences and tastes. And it's easy to remain, at a party with somebody while you have these differences in play. They can be fun to poke at one another with. Now these divisions can get more personal and heated, like Republican or Democrat, religious or non-religious, rich or poor. Now these types of categories divide us ideologically. And it can be hard to remain in the same room with someone that you're on opposing sides of the line on without getting into heated arguments. But Jesus says something a little more disturbing. Do you think I came to bring peace to this land? No, I tell you, but division. Then he goes on to say what kind of division? One that takes place within families, sons against fathers, mothers against daughters and such. Dividing household? Like, what would Focus on the Family's James Dobson say about this? What about family values? I was quite confused on this passage, so I had to dig into it and to some resources to help figure this out. Thank you, Dr. Chris Green, for your podcast again. It's awesome. Now, the ways we divide ourselves are not good enough or accurate enough to define the two categories that Jesus is dividing between, just and unjust. Now, culture wars divide according to vocabulary, which can be helpful in part, but defining things. Political wars divide us tribally according to red or blue. But again, neither side perfectly encapsulates just and unjust. Religious categories divide us according to proclaimed belief, but the massive amounts of woes that come from Jesus towards the religiously affiliated proves that it's not accurate enough to just define just and unjust in that category. The division Christ speaks of is not like anything that we can do ourselves. It is not national, racial, religious, political, economic. This judgment divides through the most intimate affiliation that they held in their imaginations, the family system. Now we must remember that all this language of judgment is for us, not against us. Truth hurts. When an alcoholic is confronted with the truth of the situation that they have been in denial about, it burns like fire. When a racist is confronted with their ignored or denied racism, it burns. When God's perfect love arrives in lives, it can burn the areas that hid in the darkness of unawareness and denial. It can burn the areas of injustice and violence that we have held to, benefited from, and consciously or unconsciously inflicted upon others. Tribal affiliation is not accurate enough for this kind of judgment, because we like to hide behind our tribal banners. But God's love will divide us out from affiliations in order to burn anything false and violent from us. And because we are then divided out and this stuff is burned out, we become healed and whole. We always transmit our pain unto others until it is healed. And God is committed to stopping this cycle in each and every human heart. And it always feels like fire. Now, I have always been fascinated by the weather. As a teenager, I would sit in our covered front porch and I would watch storms go by. I would watch the Weather Channel every night for hours on end, and that was before they had interesting programming. I just watched the forecasts and the radars. I'd watch different clouds outside and wonder what each one meant for the coming weather. Now, in today's passage, we have Jesus mentioning some common ways the people would use to forecast the weather. It was really important because without climate control situations like AC and heat and all that, and sprinkling systems, it could mean the difference between life and death in the journey across the desert. Or it could mean the difference between having food or a famine. Weather forecasting was a critical skill in their ability to manage the fragile lives that they lived. And Jesus highlights this skill, not to demean it or cheapen it, but to highlight their inability to forecast what he calls this moment. We must remember that Jesus is on pilgrimage to Jerusalem for the Passover, but he also knows that is where he will die, at the hands of the religious and political powers. Thousands have joined his traveling party as they pilgrim there, believing him to be the Messiah. And with that belief comes expectation. He will claim the throne of David with a grand entry into Jerusalem, which he does, and we recognize this on Palm Sunday. Then the Messiah is going to cleanse the temple and all of the corruption that creeped into that temple system. You know, the Roman influence had idolatrous statues all around the temple, but also the Sadducees who controlled the temple had a whole market system that made them rich and stole, a widow's last 2 cents in order to keep her connected to the community. Now, Jesus fulfills these 2 expectations, but fails the third, to rally the people in a military rebellion against Rome. And they turn on him and have him crucified. Now, Jesus, being fully human, is angry and irritated with the people. Like, can't you see what I see? If you refuse to repent of your tribal desire to wage war on the Romans, they will lay waste to your country, people, and temple. There will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. It will be like being cast into utter darkness. It will be a fire that cannot be quenched. They will turn your life and your city and your town and your culture into a flaming garbage dump, which they called Gehenna, which translates into the English language as hell. Jesus is speaking of an actual physical place that existed outside of the city walls, and a specific event that will happen in 70 AD when Rome will make the city look just like that valley where you toss all your trash to burn. Now, the people, while skilled in meteorology predictions, cannot forecast this present moment and what their tribal attitudes and hatreds are going to bring upon themselves. And if we're honest, we find ourselves in a similar place. With all our technology that helps us manage our lives, we cannot seem to get along with one another along tribal lines. We war with one another for power and dominance. We have contempt and condescension for those outside of our tribal lines. We use religion as a way of tribally identifying with the correct side and then weaponize our self-righteousness against our human brothers and sisters. But as stated before, no tribe has God on their side against all the other tribes. The kingdom will not come when one tribe gains dominance over all the others and imposes that will upon the world. The judgment of God divides through each human heart, purifying us, healing us, restoring us as we allow it. And this becomes the foundation of a better world. The kingdom of God includes every tribe and tongue and nation. And this is the good news of God's restorative justice and judgment.
Psalm 82, retold by Malcolm Guite. For things are not so helpless as they seem. God stands among the rulers as a judge. He has no partiality. We deem ourselves better than others, hold a grudge against the stranger in our midst, reject the ones who aren't like us, but he will judge the world in righteousness. He will reject the special pleading of the privileged and bless the meek instead. If we reflect a little in this earthly pilgrimage on how he loved the other, the outcast, then we will learn to share our heritage, not keep it only for our kin and caste, but gather as the children of one King, as kindred in our Father's house at last.
Well, hey, thanks so much for joining us today online in this digital space. I hope you found some hope, help, and healing. I hope you found a little bit of perspective on a really tough verse. Hey, stay tuned for some blooper reels following the recording because I messed up a couple times. Now, if you found this service helpful and identify with the spirit of the teaching here, there's some ways that you can partner with us. You can, like our pages on Facebook or Instagram. Stay tuned in to what is going on there. We release these videos every Sunday, as well as we see a breakdown of these little smaller pieces on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. You can also subscribe on YouTube if you want to see an early release. Sometime around Friday, we release this video. And if you like or comment down below, it actually helps others find us by triggering all those internet algorithm thingies that I don't quite understand so well. Now, if you're in exile from a faith community and you can't seem to find a community in your geographical location, you can actually have a spiritual home with us for a little while. You can join in whatever capacity you can and belong with us, because we're covenant and not creedal, so we don't ask you to make all these crazy adherences to statements that you might have a problem with. Now, if you find yourself in a dark night of the soul or deconstruction process and you're not sure how to make sense of your faith anymore, I do one-on-one spiritual direction. You can just reach out on our website, fcclingsburg.com, and I'll guide you through the dark. I've been there before, that's for sure. And if you'd like to partner with us financially, there's a link on the bottom of your screen right down here. You can just type that into your little searchy bar up here. It'll take you to a place, and you can give a one-time or do an ongoing. Anything helps. And peace out. We will see you next week for week number 3 of Bad Religion. And then we'll talk about some more stuff or something. I don't know how to end this one. Gotta keep the legs limber. Don't lock the knees, you'll fall over. Not built on a unifying what the heck? Okay, you got this. Try again. This is a tough one. Hey, stop digging. What do you got? Oh, tore up tennis ball. Goes here first, instinctively, not extinctively. Dang it. Try again.